He thought he could humiliate her in front of 200 students, but Professor Harrington had no idea he was about to destroy his own reputation. "You solve this," he smirked, pointing at Emily Carter, the quiet woman everyone thought was just a janitor. Laughter rippled across the lecture hall as she stepped forward, gripping the chalk. The room buzzed, then slowly fell silent. Line by line, she solved the impossible equation faster than anyone could follow. Harrington's smile faded. Then she paused, erased a section, and rewrote it. "Your method is flawed," she said calmly. The room froze. His entire theory, collapsing in seconds. And then someone whispered her name. He thought humiliating her would be easy, a quick display of authority in front of 200 students, but Professor Richard Harrington had no idea he was about to expose the one mistake that could unravel his entire reputation. The lecture hall at Westbridge University shimmered under bright fluorescent lights, rows of polished wooden desks rising like steps in an arena, every seat filled, every eye fixed on the man at the front. Harrington stood tall in his tailored navy suit, silver hair perfectly combed, his voice sharp and confident as he filled the massive chalkboard with symbols that most in the room barely understood. This wasn't just a lecture, it was a performance, and he was used to being the smartest person in it. Near the back, almost invisible among the sea of graduate students, sat Emily Carter, her gray cardigan slightly worn at the sleeves, her notebook filled with careful, precise handwriting. She didn't speak, didn't raise her hand, didn't try to be noticed, and that was exactly why she stood out to him. Harrington's eyes scanned the room, calculating, searching for someone safe, someone he could use to reinforce his dominance, and then he saw her. A faint smirk curved his lips as he paused mid-sentence, the chalk tapping once against the board, the sound echoing louder than it should have. "You," he said, pointing directly toward the back, his tone already laced with quiet condescension. "Why don't you come up here and show us how you'd approach this?" A ripple of murmurs spread. Instantly, students turning in their seats, curious, amused, some already suppressing smiles. Emily hesitated for just a fraction of a second, her fingers tightening slightly around her pen, before she slowly stood. The distance from her seat to the front of the room felt longer than it should have, every step measured, the soft sound of her shoes against the polished floor echoing in the growing silence. Harrington stepped aside with exaggerated politeness, gesturing toward the board as if offering her a stage, though the glint in his eyes made his intentions unmistakably clear. "Take your time," he added, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear the mockery hidden beneath it. A few quiet chuckles slipped through the crowd, the kind that stung more because they tried to stay subtle. Emily reached the board and picked up the chalk, the fine dust settling lightly against her fingertips. For a moment, she didn't write. She simply looked at the equation, her expression calm, almost detached, as if the noise behind her had already faded away. Harrington folded his arms, watching, waiting, confident. To him, this was already over. But something shifted, so subtle most didn't notice it at first. The room, once filled with restless energy, began to settle into an uneasy stillness. Emily's posture straightened, her grip on the chalk steadied, and when she finally made her first mark, it wasn't hesitant. It was precise, clean, intentional. The faint scratching sound against the board seemed louder now, each line deliberate, each symbol placed with quiet certainty. A few students leaned forward, their amusement fading into curiosity. Harrington's smirk flickered, just for a second, before returning, though not quite as confident as before. Emily continued, her movements fluid, unhurried, as if she had already solved this problem long before she ever stepped into the room. And then, without turning around, she paused, the chalk hovering just above the surface, as if deciding something, as if noticing something no one else had yet seen. The chalk hovered for a fraction longer, and in that small pause, something shifted again, something deeper, almost imperceptible, yet powerful enough to change the air in the room. Emily's eyes narrowed slightly as she studied the equation, not with hesitation, but with recognition, as if she was not solving it for the first time, but revisiting something she already understood on a far deeper level than anyone else in that hall. Behind her, the students who had been whispering moments ago now leaned forward, their curiosity slowly replacing their earlier amusement. Harrington uncrossed his arms, stepping a little closer, his polished shoes clicking softly against the floor, his gaze tightening on the board. He had seen confidence before, but this was different. This was not the nervous determination of someone trying to prove themselves. This was calm. Too calm. Emily continued writing, each line flowing into the next with a quiet precision that began to draw attention. The structure of the solution was not only correct, it was elegant, almost disturbingly so. A few students exchanged glances, their brows furrowing as they tried to follow her logic, only to realize they were already falling behind. The room grew quieter, not because anyone was told to be silent, but because something about what was happening demanded it. Harrington's expression shifted again, the faintest crease forming between his brows as he stepped even closer to the board, now only a few feet away from her. He opened his mouth as if to interrupt, to reassert control, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was the certainty in her movements, or perhaps it was the uncomfortable realization that he did not yet understand where she was going. Emily reached the midpoint of the equation and paused again, this time longer, her hand lowering slightly as she studied what she had written. The silence deepened, stretching across the room like a held breath. Then, slowly, she lifted the chalk and drew a single line through one of the earlier steps. A soft murmur rippled through the audience. Harrington's eyes snapped to that mark instantly. That step was his step. The one he had emphasized earlier, the one he had presented as essential. Emily did not rush. She erased the section carefully, the chalk dust falling in soft white traces onto the ledge below, and began rewriting it, her voice finally breaking the silence, calm, steady, and unmistakably certain. "There is a constraint missing here," she said, not turning to face him, not raising her voice, simply stating it as a fact. The words landed heavier than any accusation. Harrington stiffened, his jaw tightening slightly as he leaned closer, scanning the board, following her correction. For a moment, he looked as if he was about to dismiss her, to wave it off, to reclaim the authority he had never lost before. But then he stopped. His eyes moved faster now, tracing her logic, checking each transformation, each substitution, each conclusion. The confidence that had defined him just minutes ago began to flicker. Around them, the students sensed it. The shift was undeniable now. This was no longer a demonstration. This was something else entirely. Emily continued, her writing accelerating just slightly, not rushed, but assured, as if the path ahead had already been mapped out in her mind long before she ever touched the board. When she reached the final line, she placed the chalk down gently and stepped back. The solution stood there, complete, refined, and disturbingly clear. No one spoke. No one moved. The room had fallen into a silence so complete it felt almost unreal. Harrington stared at the board, his eyes fixed, unblinking, as he processed what he was seeing. Seconds passed, though they felt much longer. Then, almost reluctantly, he reached forward and picked up a piece of chalk, retracing one part of her work, checking it again. And again. Each time arriving at the same conclusion. Correct. Perfectly correct. His hand lowered slowly. For the first time in years, he did not have an immediate response. Behind him, a single voice, barely above a whisper, broke through the silence, carrying just enough to be heard by those closest, and then spreading like a ripple across the room. Wait. Emily Carter. The name lingered in the air, unfinished, as if it carried a meaning not everyone yet understood. The name did not land like a question. It landed like a realization, quiet but heavy, and the moment it was spoken, the energy in the room shifted again, sharper this time, more focused, as if something invisible had just clicked into place for a few people who suddenly understood more than the rest. Harrington turned slightly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the faces in the front row, searching for the source, his composure still intact but no longer unshakable. "What about her name?" he asked, his tone controlled, though the edge beneath it was unmistakable. No one answered immediately. The silence stretched, filled with glances being exchanged, thoughts racing, connections forming. Emily remained still beside the board, her hands relaxed at her sides, her gaze steady, not on the students, not even on Harrington, but somewhere slightly above, as if she had already stepped beyond the moment unfolding around her. One student in the second row leaned toward another, whispering more urgently now, their earlier amusement completely gone. Another pulled out a phone, fingers moving quickly, searching, verifying, confirming something they were not yet ready to say out loud. Harrington noticed the movement, the distraction, and, for the first time, irritation crept into his expression. He turned back to the board, to her solution, as if grounding himself in the one place he had always been certain. Even if this is correct, he said, his voice louder now, reclaiming the room by force of habit, it does not change the fact that this framework has been validated repeatedly. He tapped the section she had erased earlier, though his confidence in that gesture was no longer absolute. Emily finally shifted her gaze toward him, calm, unhurried, as if she had been waiting for that exact response. It has been validated under limited conditions, she replied, her voice even, clear enough to carry across the entire hall without effort. But outside those parameters, the error compounds. The words were precise, not confrontational, but they landed with undeniable weight. A few students nodded slowly, beginning to follow the implication. Harrington's jaw tightened. He picked up the chalk again, quickly rewriting part of his original method beside hers, his movements sharper now, more deliberate, as if speed alone could restore authority. Then show where it fails, he said, turning back to her, issuing the challenge with a firmness that had returned, though not as solid as before. Emily did not hesitate. She stepped forward again, lifting the chalk with the same quiet confidence, and began extending the equation beyond the point where Harrington had stopped. The room leaned in, drawn by something they could no longer dismiss. Line by line, she pushed the logic further, exposing the instability hidden beneath the surface, the flaw that only appeared when the problem was expanded just slightly beyond its original scope. The moment it revealed itself, it was unmistakable. A break in the pattern. A contradiction that could not be ignored. A soft, collective intake of breath swept through the room. Harrington stared at it, his eyes moving rapidly, recalculating, rechecking, searching for an error that was not there. His hand hovered midair, as if reaching for a correction that refused to appear. The confidence that had once defined every movement now faltered, replaced by something far more unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Behind him, more whispers spread, no longer mocking, no longer doubtful, but filled with a growing sense of awe. One voice, clearer this time, spoke again, louder than before, no longer hesitant. She published that model, the student said, eyes fixed on the board, then on Emily. 3 years ago. Under a different name. The words settled over the room like a revelation. Harrington froze, the chalk slipping slightly in his fingers as he turned back to her fully, really seeing her now for the first time. Is that true? He asked, the question quieter than anything he had said all day. Emily met his gaze without flinching, her expression steady, composed, untouched by the tension surrounding them. For a brief moment, she said nothing. And in that silence, the entire room waited, the weight of what was about to be confirmed pressing down on every single person inside. The silence stretched just long enough to make every heartbeat in the room feel louder, heavier, as if the entire lecture hall was holding its breath, waiting for a single word that could shift. Everything. Emily finally spoke, her voice calm, steady, untouched by the tension that had consumed everyone else. Yes, she said simply. No hesitation, no embellishment, just the truth delivered without effort. The effect was immediate. A ripple moved through the students, no longer whispers of curiosity, but sharp bursts of realization. Phones came out faster now, screens lighting up, fingers searching with urgency. Within seconds, confirmations began to spread, quiet at first, then stronger, undeniable. She is right, someone murmured. It is her work. Harrington did not move. For a man who had built his career on certainty, on commanding every room he entered, the stillness that now held him was unfamiliar, almost foreign. His eyes returned to the board, scanning the equations again, but this time not as a teacher correcting a student, but as a man confronting something he had overlooked. The flaw was there. Clear. Precise. Impossible to deny now that it had been revealed. He swallowed slightly, the motion subtle, but visible in the complete silence. "You're saying," he began, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier sharpness, "that the foundation I have been teaching." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. Emily stepped slightly to the side, giving him a clear view of both solutions, hers and his, existing side by side like a comparison no one could ignore. "It works," she said carefully, not dismissive, not attacking, but only within a controlled range. Beyond that, the instability grows exponentially. Her words were measured, almost respectful, but they carried a weight that pressed down on the room. Harrington's fingers tightened slightly around the chalk in his hand. He looked at the students, at their faces, at the way their attention had shifted completely away from him. For the first time in years, he was no longer the center of certainty. He was the one catching up. A quiet cough echoed somewhere in the back, then stopped abruptly, as if even that small sound felt out of place. Harrington turned back to Emily, studying her now, really studying her, as if trying to understand how he had missed something so significant. "Why did you not say anything earlier?" he asked, the question more genuine than anything he had said before. Emily held his gaze, her expression steady, her posture relaxed, as if the answer did not require defense. "No one asked," she replied. The simplicity of it landed harder than any accusation could have. A few students shifted in their seats, the truth in her words settling into them, uncomfortable but undeniable. Harrington let out a slow breath, almost imperceptible, his shoulders lowering just slightly. The authority he had carried so effortlessly was not gone, but it had changed. It was no longer absolute. He stepped back from the board, giving her space, an action that, in this room, spoke louder than any apology. Emily reached forward one last time, adding a final line beneath the equation, a clean conclusion that tied everything together with quiet precision. Then she placed the chalk down and stepped away completely. No flourish. No demand for recognition. Just silence. The room remained still, no applause, no immediate reaction, as if everyone present needed a moment to fully process what they had just witnessed. And in that silence, something subtle but undeniable had shifted, not just in the equations on the board, but in the way every person in that lecture hall understood the difference between authority and truth. No one clapped. Not because they were unimpressed, but because the moment did not allow it. The silence that filled the lecture hall was heavier than applause, thicker than any reaction they could have given, as if something deeper had just settled over every person in the room. Emily stood a few feet away from the board now, no longer at the center of attention, yet somehow impossible to ignore. Her presence had shifted from invisible to undeniable, and no one quite knew how to respond to that change. Professor Harrington remained still, his eyes moving once more between the two solutions, the one he had trusted for years and the one that had just quietly dismantled its limits in front of everyone. His reflection stared back at him from the polished surface of the board, faint but present, a reminder that this moment was not just about mathematics. It was about something far more personal. He set the chalk down slowly, deliberately, as if acknowledging that whatever came next required more than correction. "Class dismissed," he said finally, his voice calm, but different now, stripped of the sharp authority it once carried. No one moved at first. The words felt out of place, almost too ordinary for what had just happened. Then, gradually, chairs shifted, notebooks closed, and the quiet shuffle of students gathering their things filled the space. But they did not leave quickly. Many lingered, glancing back toward the front, toward Emily, toward the board, toward the man who had always seemed unshakable. A few students approached cautiously, their expressions no longer amused or indifferent, but respectful, even hesitant. One stopped a few feet away from Emily, unsure of how to begin, as if speaking to her now required a different kind of courage. "That was incredible," he managed, his voice softer than expected. Emily offered a small nod, nothing more, her response as measured as everything else about her. Across the room, whispers continued, but they were no longer dismissive. Names were being searched, articles being pulled up, connections being confirmed in real time. The truth was spreading, not loudly, but steadily, like a current moving through the room. Harrington watched it all, his posture unchanged, but his expression thoughtful, almost distant. He had spent years building certainty, teaching it, defending it, believing in it. And in a matter of minutes, that certainty had been challenged, not with arrogance, not with noise, but with quiet precision. He turned toward Emily again, this time without the distance of authority between them. "Miss Carter," he said, using her name with intention now, "would you stay for a moment?" The room, already slow to empty, seemed to pause again, students lingering just a little longer, curious about what would follow. Emily looked at him, her expression neutral, unreadable, then gave a slight nod. One by one, the remaining students filtered out, though many cast final glances over their shoulders before disappearing into the hallway. The doors closed softly, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before. More contained, more focused. The large lecture hall, once filled with energy and expectation, now held only two people standing at the front, separated by a few feet and an entirely new understanding. Harrington exhaled slowly, as if releasing something he had carried for a long time. "I have taught that framework for nearly a decade," he said, his voice quieter now, no longer performing, no longer projecting. "And no one has ever challenged it like that." Emily did not respond immediately. She glanced once more at the board, at the equations that still remained, then back at him. "Most people do not look past what works," she said calmly. "They stop at results." Harrington considered that, his gaze drifting back to the board as well. "And you did not," he said. "It was not a question." Emily's eyes softened just slightly, though her composure remained intact. "I could not," she replied. Another pause followed, not uncomfortable, but thoughtful, as if both of them were standing in a moment that required reflection rather than reaction. Harrington straightened slightly, a subtle return of presence, though not the same as before. "You said the instability grows beyond a certain range," he continued, his tone now more curious than defensive. "How far does it go?" Emily looked at him for a long second, then back at the board, her gaze focusing on the final line she had written. "Far enough," she said quietly, "that everything built on it begins to shift." The words lingered in the air, not just as a mathematical conclusion, but as something broader, something neither of them needed to explain further. And in that quiet space, the lesson had already gone far beyond the equation. Harrington did not respond immediately, and for a moment, the only sound left in the lecture hall was the faint hum of the overhead lights, steady and indifferent to everything that had just changed. He studied the board again, but this time not as a man defending his work, rather as someone seeing it from a distance for the first time, as if the certainty he once relied on had quietly stepped aside, leaving space for something else to take its place. Emily remained where she was, composed, patient, not pressing the moment forward, allowing it to unfold at its own pace. That, more than anything, unsettled him in a way he could not quite explain. Most people filled silence with words, with explanations, with attempts to reclaim ground. She did not. She simply stood there, as if she had nothing to prove. "You said everything built on it begins to shift," Harrington said finally, his voice measured, thoughtful, as if testing each word before letting it exist. "That implies consequences far beyond a single equation." Emily gave a small nod, her gaze still resting on the board. "It does," she replied. "It changes how the model behaves under pressure. Small deviations at the start become significant over time." Harrington's eyes followed the path of her reasoning, imagining the implications stretching outward, beyond the classroom, beyond the theory itself. Research built on that framework, papers, conclusions, assumptions accepted without question. He drew in a slow breath, the weight of that realization settling deeper than he expected. "And no one caught this?" he asked, though the answer was already beginning to form in his mind. Emily's expression softened just slightly, not with judgment, but with understanding. "It is not easy to see something when you trust it," she said. "Especially when it works well enough most of the time." The words lingered, quiet, but unmistakably true. Harrington let out a faint exhale, almost a quiet acknowledgement rather than a reaction. He had spent years teaching others to question, to challenge, to think beyond what was presented, yet in his own work, he had stopped at what was sufficient. The realization was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, precise, unavoidable. He walked a few steps along the front of the room, his shoes echoing softly against the floor, then stopped, turning back toward her with a different kind of focus. "Why stay quiet?" he asked, not accusing, not defensive, but genuinely curious now. "If you saw this years ago, why not step forward then?" Emily considered the question for a moment, her eyes lowering slightly as if searching for the simplest way to explain something that was not simple at all. "Timing matters," she said at last. "So does the room." Harrington studied her, the meaning of that answer unfolding gradually. It was not about ability. It was about being heard. About when someone was willing to listen. He glanced around the empty lecture hall, the rows of seats now vacant, the space that had once been filled with noise and assumption now reduced to quiet clarity. "And today?" he asked. Emily looked at him directly, her gaze steady, unguarded. "Today, you asked," she said. The simplicity of it carried more weight than any elaborate explanation could have. Harrington nodded slowly, the truth of that settling into place. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The board still held the evidence of everything that had changed, the contrast between two ways of seeing the same problem, one limited, one expanded. Finally, Harrington reached for the eraser, then paused, his hand hovering just short of the surface. Instead of wiping the board clean, he lowered his hand and stepped back. "Leave it," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. For now, Emily did not question it. She simply watched as he took a step back, giving the equations the space they seemed to demand. The silence returned again, but this time it felt different. Not heavy, not tense, just still. And in that stillness, something fundamental had shifted, not through force, not through confrontation, but through a quiet moment where truth had been allowed to stand exactly as it was. The chalk lines remained on the board, untouched, as if the room itself had decided they deserved more time, more space, more attention than anything that had come before. Harrington stood with his hands loosely at his sides, no longer trying to fill the silence, no longer trying to control it. For the first time in years, he allowed a moment to exist without shaping it. Emily shifted slightly, not to leave, but to step closer to the board again, her eyes tracing the equations one more time, not correcting, not adding, just observing. The quiet between them was no longer uncertain. It was deliberate. Outside the lecture hall, faint footsteps passed by, distant voices echoing through the corridor, reminders that the rest of the world continued as usual. But inside, time felt slower, more intentional, as if the space itself recognized that something worth understanding had just happened. Harrington finally spoke, his voice measured, thoughtful in a way that carried no trace of performance. "There is a conference next month," he said, glancing briefly at the board before returning his gaze to her. "A symposium on applied modeling. This framework is part of the discussion." He paused, not out of hesitation, but as if choosing his next words carefully. "It should not be presented the way it is now." Emily listened without interrupting, her posture relaxed, her expression steady. "Then it should be corrected," she replied simply. Harrington gave a faint nod, though something in his eyes suggested that the answer, while clear, was not easy. "Correction requires more than acknowledgement," he said. "It requires clarity, precision, and," he hesitated for just a fraction of a second, "credibility." The word lingered, carrying layers of meaning that did not need to be explained. Emily understood. She had understood long before this moment. Her gaze shifted briefly toward the empty seats, the space that had once been filled with doubt, with dismissal, with assumptions made too quickly. Credibility is often decided before the work is even seen, she said quietly. Harrington did not argue. He could not. Instead, he walked back toward the board, studying her solution again, not as something separate from his own, but as something that now needed to be integrated, understood, and carried forward correctly. If this is presented, he continued, his tone more certain now, it needs to be done properly. With the full context. With the correct attribution. He turned to face her again, the distance between them unchanged, yet entirely different in meaning. Would you be willing to be part of that? The question hung in the air, not as an offer of favor, but as a recognition of necessity. Emily considered it, her eyes calm, thoughtful. This was not the first time she had faced a decision like this, and it would not be the last. But something about this moment was different. Not because of the opportunity, but because of how it had been reached. If the goal is to improve the work, she said, then yes. Harrington held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, firmly. It was not a dramatic gesture, but it carried the weight of acceptance, of adjustment, of a shift in understanding that extended beyond the classroom. He stepped aside slightly, giving her an unobstructed view of the board, as if acknowledging that what remained there belonged just as much to her as it ever had to him. The silence returned again, but this time it felt settled, resolved in a way that did not demand further words. Emily took a final look at the equations, then turned toward the aisle, her steps quiet against the floor as she began to leave. Harrington watched her go, not with authority, not with judgment, but with a quiet recognition that something important had passed through his classroom, something he had nearly overlooked. As the door closed softly behind her, the room remained still, the board unchanged, the lesson lingering far beyond the numbers written in chalk. And for the first time in a long time, Harrington did not reach for the eraser. The door closed with a soft click, and for a brief moment, the sound echoed longer than it should have, lingering in the empty lecture hall like a quiet punctuation mark at the end of something that was not quite finished. Harrington remained where he stood, his eyes fixed on the board, the equations still untouched, still alive with the tension and clarity that had reshaped everything he thought he understood. Minutes passed, though he did not notice them. His mind moved through the logic again, tracing her corrections, not searching for flaws anymore, but understanding them, absorbing them, allowing them to settle into place where his certainty once lived. Outside, the hallway had grown busier, voices returning, footsteps quick and distracted, the rhythm of campus life resuming as if nothing had happened. But inside the room, the air remained different, quieter, sharper, as if it had been permanently altered. Later that afternoon, the lecture hall filled again, not for a class, but for something else entirely. Word had spread faster than anyone expected. Students who had not been there earlier now took seats with quiet anticipation, their conversations hushed, their attention fixed on the board that had not been erased. A few who had witnessed the moment firsthand sat closer to the front, their expressions more serious now, no longer casual observers, but witnesses to something they understood carried weight. Harrington entered without announcement, his usual presence unchanged on the surface, but something subtle in his posture had shifted. He did not immediately begin speaking. Instead, he walked directly to the board, standing beside the equations as if acknowledging them before anything else. The room settled into silence without being asked. "This," he said finally, his voice steady, clear, "is where we stopped earlier." He gestured toward the solution, not separating his work from hers, not drawing a line between them, just presenting it as it was. "And this," he continued, indicating the correction, "is where we needed to go." A few students exchanged glances, surprised by the directness, by the absence of defense, by the clarity of the admission. Harrington turned slightly, his gaze moving across the room, meeting the eyes of students who now watched him differently than they had before. There was an assumption built into this model, he said, one that held under certain conditions, but not beyond them. He paused, allowing the statement to settle, allowing the room to follow without rushing them. That limitation was identified this morning. He did not say her name immediately. He did not need to. The recognition was already there, carried quietly among those who knew. A hand raised hesitantly near the front. "Professor," the student began, "does that mean the previous conclusions?" He did not finish the question, but it hung clearly in the air. Harrington nodded once, a controlled, deliberate acknowledgement. "It means they need to be revisited," he said. There was no hesitation in his voice now, no attempt to soften it. Just the truth, presented without resistance. A murmur moved through the room, not chaotic, but thoughtful, as students processed the implications. Harrington turned back to the board again, picking up a piece of chalk, but this time his movements were different. Slower. More deliberate. He began rewriting the corrected version, step by step, not as a demonstration of authority, but as a reconstruction of understanding. Each line carried weight, not just mathematically, but intellectually. And as he wrote, the room followed, not out of obligation, but out of genuine focus. Halfway through, he paused, glancing briefly toward the door, as if expecting something or someone, though no one entered. The moment passed, and he continued, finishing the sequence with a clarity that matched what had been shown to him earlier. When he set the chalk down, the silence returned again, not empty, but full, as if every person present understood that they had just witnessed more than a correction. They had witnessed a shift. Harrington faced the room once more, his expression composed, but undeniably changed. "Understanding evolves," he said quietly, "but only when we are willing to see beyond what we expect." No one spoke. No one needed to. And somewhere in the back row, an empty seat remained, unnoticed by most, but not by him.